Do agricultural companies that own intellectual property rights on seeds and plant varieties have a right to food responsibility? Food and agricultural biodiversity contains components of biological diversity which are important for feeding human populations and improving the quality of life. This covers the diversity and variation of the genetic, species, and ecosystem rates of habitats, animals, plants, and microorganisms required to sustain human life, as well as the main functions of ecosystems. Diversity is the result of thousands of years of activities by farmers and breeders, land and forest use, and fisheries and aquaculture, combined with millions of years of natural selection. Many years ago, farmers have always saved, replanted, exchanged, and sold their seeds without any restrictions, and this practice constitutes the backbone of agricultural biodiversity, which in turn is crucial to food security. The current global framework on intellectual property rights, or the IPRs, on seeds and plant varieties can hinder local farmers from enjoying this crucial freedom to save, reuse, and change their seeds, and this might in turn have a negative impact on the right to food in general and the right to food security in particular. The right to food implies not only access to food, but also access to the means of producing it. However, IPRs on seeds and plant varieties can make it more difficult for small-scale farmers to gain access to the means of producing their food. Thus, the current global framework on IPRs threatens both agricultural biodiversity and access to the means of food production for small-scale farmers. This implies both for food security and the right to food. The protection of seeds and plant varieties via intellectual property laws. So there are two major multilateral treaties that regulate the protection of plant-related innovation via intellectual property laws: the UPOV Convention and the TRIPS Agreement.
We prepared 5 questions for you to understand the protections of plant varieties under UPOV in a simpler way. So as for the first question, why is plant variety protection necessary? An effective plant variety protection system can provide important benefits in an international context by removing barriers to trade in varieties, thereby increasing domestic and international market scope. Breeders are unlikely to release valuable varieties into a country without effective protection. For the second question, how does plant variety protection work? So the UPOV Convention provides the basis for members to encourage plant breeding by granting breeders of new plant varieties an intellectual property right, which is the breeder's right. The breeder's right means that the authorization of the breeder is required to propagate the variety for commercial purposes. The UPOV Convention specifies that the acts that require the breeder's authorization in respect of the propagating material of a protected variety and under certain conditions in respect of the harvested material. UPOV members may also decide to extend protection to products made directly from harvested material under certain conditions. Article 19 of UPOV 1991 also extends the duration of protection from not less than 15 years in Article 8 of UPOV 1978 to not less than 20 years from the date of the grant of the breeder's right. Third, can a farmer sell seed of a protected variety without the authorization of the breeder? So, the authorization of the breeder is required for the selling of seed of a protected variety by any person. Under the 1978 Act of the UPOV Convention, the prior authorization of the breeder is required for the offering for sale and the marketing of the reproductive or vegetative propagating material as such of the variety. Under the 1991 Act of the UPOV Convention, the offering for sale and selling or other marketing of the propagating material of the protected variety requires authorization of the breeder. Fourth question, what is the effect of plant variety protection on varieties that are not protected? Plant variety protection does not restrict the ability of farmers to grow and sell propagating material of non-protected varieties. For the last question, what are the UPOV 1978 and UPOV 1991 breeders' exemption and the farmers' privilege? For the breeders' exemption of UPOV 1978 permits the use of the variety as an initial source of variation for the purpose of creating other varieties or for the marketing of such varieties. And the UPOV 1991 retains certain exemption for breeders, such as the exemption of acts done privately and for non-commercial purposes and acts done for experimental purposes only. As for the pharmacist privilege of UPOV 1978, the exemption benefits farmers who purchase the seeds of protected varieties, thus provides a basis for permitting farmers to save seeds and even to sell limited quantities of seeds to other farmers. And the UPOV 1991 permits farmers to save seeds, but it prohibits farmers from selling or exchanging seeds with other farmers.
Protection of plant-related innovations under TRIPS. The TRIPS Agreement is the first and only IPR treaty that seeks to establish universal, minimum standards of protection across major fields of intellectual property, including patents, copyrights, trademarks, industrial designs, integrated circuits, and trade secrets. Article 27 of the TRIPS Agreement permits countries to exclude plants from patent protection, although it requires them to provide protection for plant varieties, either by patents or by an effective sui generis system. A sui generis system is a system that is unique or of its own kind. Patent protection means that the invention cannot be commercially made, used, distributed, imported, or sold by others without the patent owner's consent. The TRIPS agreement does not require countries to implement UPOV, but some bilateral and regional trade agreements require countries to either allow UPOV or provide patent protection for plants. In the absence of any trade agreement mandating countries to implement any of the UPOV acts, countries have a significant amount of flexibility in terms of how they can provide protection for plant varieties under the TRIPS agreement. While the protection of plant varieties via the grant of patent rights might provide sufficient protection for plant breeders, it may not be in the best interest for farmers, especially poor farmers in developing countries. As stated in Article 28 of the TRIPS Agreement, owners of patent rights are given a broad range of rights, such as the right to prevent others from making, using, offering for sale, selling, or importing the patented product. Patent rights confer a broad range of rights on patent owners. Farmers that rely on patented seeds have little or no control over those seeds. It should be noted that patents may be granted for both genetically engineered seeds and traditional seeds. These rights eliminate competition and empower the patent owner to determine the price of the patented product, and this can impact access to the patented product. So, companies that own patent on seeds can decide to increase or decrease the price of those patented seeds, which can negatively impact poor farmers. Farmers cultivating patented seeds are considered to be licensed seeds of a patented product, and they are frequently requested to sign agreements not to save, resow, or exchange the seeds which they buy from patent holders. Although the TRIPS agreement devotes only minimal attention to plant breeders' rights or plant variety protection and does not even mention the UPOV Acts, its adoption has done more to encourage the legal protection of plant varieties than any other international agreement.
The relationship between intellectual property rights on seeds/plant varieties and the human right to food. So the first thing we're going to talk about is first enunciation of the human right to food, Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services. The next one is Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights of 1966, containing a more detailed articulation of the right to food. It states that it is the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate of food, and it also states to improve methods of production, conservation, and distribution of food by making full use of the technical and scientific knowledge. The next one is Jean Ziegler, UN Special Rapporteur, said that the right to food implies not only access to food but also access the means of producing it. Every individual must have permanent access at all times to sufficient and adequate food. The next one is by D. Schutter, The right to food requires that we place the needs of the most marginalized groups, including in particular smallholders in developing countries, at the center of our efforts. Farmers often receive commercial varieties as part of a package that includes vouchers, seed, fertilizer, and pesticide. Poor farmers usually have little or no choice than to rely on seeds protected by intellectual property laws.
The right to food responsibilities of agricultural companies that own IPRs on seeds and plant varieties. States bear the primary responsibility to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to food. Activities of non-state actors such as agricultural companies that own IPRs on seeds and plant varieties can also have a significant impact on the right to food in general and on farmers in particular. Half of the world's commercial seed market is controlled by three agricultural companies, which are Monsanto, DuPont, and Syngenta. Agricultural companies spend a lot to investigate and prosecute farmers who infringe their patent rights. Farmers are typically required to sign technology use agreements that prohibits farmers from saving seeds. There are proposed acquisitions of Monsanto by Bayer, and this might lead to an increase in the price of seeds and bundling of the sale of seeds and agrochemicals. These acquisitions have been approved in China, Brazil, European Union, and the United States, and developments like these result in increased market power and ability to increase the price of seeds, which make it more difficult for poor farmers to buy seeds at affordable prices. Measures are put into place to ensure these powers are not abused or misused, and corporate actors also have some human rights responsibilities.
The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the Right to Food. So, the guiding principles note that states should ensure that laws and policies governing the ongoing operation of the companies do not constrain but enable business respect for human rights. So, this has a connotation as to how states design and implement their intellectual property laws relating to seed and plant varieties. So, the main purpose of IPR or intellectual property law is to encourage the creation of a wide variety of intellectual goods. To achieve this, the law gives people and the businesses property rights to the information and intellectual goods they create, usually for a limited period of time. So the UNGPs has three pillars describing how the framework will be applied by states and companies. The first pillar of the guiding principles is the state's duty to protect against human rights abuses through regulation, policy making, investigation, and enforcement. The second one is the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. So, this means that businesses must act with due diligence to avoid infringing on the rights of others and to address any negative impacts. The UN guiding principles hold that companies have the power to affect virtually all of the internationally recognized rights. Therefore, there is a responsibility of both the state and the private sector to acknowledge their role in upholding and protecting human rights. Third pillar addresses that both the state's responsibility to provide access to remedy through judicial, administrative, and legislative means, and the corporate responsibility to prevent any infringement of rights that they contribute to. Having effective grievance mechanisms in place is crucial in upholding the state's duty to protect and the corporate responsibility to respect. So again, the IPR shall prevent corporate actors from abusing or misusing their IPRs in a manner that disrespects the right to food. One example is that provisions should be made in such laws for farmers to save and exchange seed. As for numbers 2 and 3, this means that since they are obliged to protect human rights, the states should be cautious of signing any papers regarding free trade agreements. Alongside with this, they are obliged as well to avoid infringing on the human rights of others, and if something bad happens, they are required to address the impacts and to act upon it immediately. For the fourth number, this means that it is important for agricultural companies that own IPRs on seeds and plant varieties to ensure that they do not enforce their laws in a manner that disrespects the human right and should not in any way that would negatively impact the ability of farmers to access the means of producing food like seeds because this would also result to disrespecting the right to food.
The advisory opinion of the International Monsanto Tribunal on the Right to Food. Monsanto Tribunal Foundation. Delivered in April 2017, they were tasked with producing an advisory opinion on 6 questions relating to the Foundation's impact to the activities on the right to a healthy environment, right to food, the right to health, the freedom indispensable for scientific research, war crimes, complicity, and ecocide. Focused on the tribunal's opinion on the impact of Monsanto's activity on the right to food and how it relates to the impact of IPR's right to food. The opinion of this tribunal is merely advisory and not binding. The right to food cannot be understood in a narrow sense of being merely the right to eat or to feed, but rather in a broad sense of having the chance to feed properly and sufficiently, healthily, and permanently, in addition to being understood as the possibility of producing food for consumption or for marketing, was not a real trial and is only for a publicity stunt and have no legal substance.
So in conclusion, for the non-state Bilachibakers. So in conclusion, for the non-state actors, agricultural companies that own IPRs on seeds and plant varieties have responsibility to respect the right to food. Companies should not disrespect the right to food by making it difficult for farmers to gain access to the means of food production. Companies should not engage in activities that negatively impact non-commercial farmers' seed system. Companies should not prevent farmers from saving and exchanging seeds because some farmers are dependent on them. And it also plays a crucial role in maintaining agricultural biodiversity. For the state, it is imperative for the state to also take seriously their human rights obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to food. It is because it is easier to hold corporate actors accountable for their responsibility to the right to food, and it is counterintuitive to expect corporate actors to simply act against their self interest in the absence of any specific provision in the law requiring them to do so.